There is a strange normality brought about by war. The human mind is a flexible mechanism, capable of adapting even to the most horrific conditions. However, for Russian people, the Kremlin's massive propaganda had turned the war into a kind of daily hypnosis. To keep society under control, the Kremlin used harsh repression and propaganda about order and stability to portray the war and losses in Ukraine as a distant problem. Protests were suppressed. The people were silenced. TVs broadcast tales of heroism. This illusion wall was more protective than missiles because it insulated the spirit of a nation from the harsh cold of reality. However, a single precise strike from the sky in a single night shattered the massive illusion wall woven into the minds of 140 million Russians, shattering Putin's strategy. On the night of September 28th, Ukraine launched one of the largest, most complex, and most coordinated attacks to date against Russia's most critical military and economic targets. Hundreds of drones, guided aerial bombs, and American-made HIMARS rockets launched from Ukraine initiated a symphony of fire, targeting 8 different regions of Russia simultaneously. The Kremlin's illusion of portraying the war as a distant operation for ordinary citizens in Moscow was shattered that night by the sounds of explosions stretching from Belgorod to Bryansk, from Kursk to Samara. Ukraine's sharpest and most ruthless blow was delivered to the beating heart of the Belgorod Oblast, namely the Luch thermal power plant, which supplies all the region's energy and lifelines. When the precision-guided HIMARS missiles found their target, first a massive fireball lit up the night, then the city was plunged into pitch darkness. The first shaky cell phone footage posted on social media documented the shock of the moment. The images showed a massive column of flame, followed by absolute darkness, as if someone had flipped a giant switch. This was not a simple power outage, it was the unplugging of the entire system upon which modern life is built. When the power grid collapsed, it created a domino effect. Water pumps stopped, internet connections were cut, and life in the city of 500,000 came to a virtual standstill. People trapped in elevators, roads blocked by non-functioning traffic lights, and shops only able to sell goods for cash. This was the reality that the war was now being fought not only on the front lines, but in Russia's own home, in the kitchen, and on the street of an ordinary citizen. Regional Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov's confirmation of significant power outages, and even more alarmingly, his warning to the public that there could be malfunctions in the missile threat warning systems, was an official admission that the Russian state had failed to fulfill its most basic duty, protecting its own citizens. Putin's 2-year strategy of freezing Ukraine had failed that night in Belgorod, condemning his own people to darkness and cold. That ominous darkness, which until then had been believed to be the fate of only Ukrainian cities, now lay like a shroud over a Russian city. And the Kremlin's greatest promise, stability and security, collapsed at that moment. Until now, this was a masterfully orchestrated psychological warfare masterpiece that planted dynamite at the foundation of Putin's 20-year rule. This operation was designed to trigger the Kremlin's deepest fear, the uncontrolled collapse of the home front. The war was no longer just something fought by heroes on the front lines. It was a cold and dark, uninvited guest seeping into every family's kitchen in Belgorod. So, with this single, flawless strike, Ukraine did not just hit a target. It changed the nature of the war. The message, to the entire world and most importantly to the Russian people, was brutally clear. Because the lights that went out that night were a warning flare illuminating the Kremlin's future. And this warning flare engraved the message: there is no safe place. War has come to your home, into Russian soil. Putin's tacit social contract with the Russian people had always been based on a simple equation. Give me political obedience, and I will provide you with stability and security. With the strike on the power plant in Belgorod, this contract was torn up before the eyes of millions. That night, stability was gone. For the first time, the physical destruction of war had systematically and shockingly entered the homes of the Russian civilian population. The power outage began to eat away at the fabric of modern life like acid. As the hours passed, it turned into an existential crisis. Heating systems stopped, water was cut off, and the internet and mobile communications infrastructure collapsed. This was not just a loss of comfort, but also a loss of control. Local telegram channels suddenly became centers of panic beyond the regime's control. Miles-long queues at gas stations, people fighting over generator fuel, crowds storming supermarkets. All of this was a state of total panic and chaos. Amidst this chaos, the question that had been whispered until then, "Why is this war happening to us?" began to be shouted out loud. This was the first major crack in the Kremlin's wall of propaganda. No matter what state television claimed, people were seeing the truth with their own eyes and feeling it in their own skin. The people's anger inevitably climbed to the top, to the center of the system, because it was Vladimir Putin himself who promised the people stability. So, how was this surgical operation, this strategic checkmate move that changed the course of the war, possible? As confirmed by open-source intelligence platforms and satellite data, the thermal power plant known as Belgorodskaya TETS was not a randomly selected civilian infrastructure facility. It was a systemic center of gravity, the heart of the military and industrial nerve network of an entire region. Ukraine's real target here was not the megawatts produced by the plant. The real target was everything dependent on those megawatts. The railways feeding the Russian army's southern front, the factories producing ammunition, the command centers directing the troops. Because this power plant supplied life to the main supply and command areas of Russia's 20th Guards Combined Arms Army, responsible for the bloodiest operations in eastern Ukraine. The energy it provided powered the radars that served as the eyes of the S-300 and S-400 air defense batteries in the region, the runway lights at military airfields, the complex communication systems in command bunkers, and most crucially, the electrical signaling infrastructure that was the lifeblood of the railway network transporting ammunition, fuel, and troops to the front lines. Therefore, striking this power plant meant not just turning off the lights, but blinding an army's eyes, deafening its ears, and crippling its legs. However, Ukrainian intelligence knew that this target was heavily guarded, precisely because it was so critical. This is where Ukraine's genius came into play. The strategy of saturating Russian air defenses. That night, a swarm of hundreds of UAVs was sent to 8 different regions of Russia. While the Russian Defense Ministry triumphantly announced that it had shot down 230 UAVs, it was unaware that it had actually fallen into a massive trap. This swarm was a smokescreen designed to occupy Russia's expensive air defense batteries, deplete their ammunition, and lock their radars in different directions. The moment this smokescreen lifted, the real deadly blow came from American-made M142 HIMARS rockets fired from near Kharkiv. The air defense batteries in Belgorod, struggling with the swarm of UAVs and likely having lost experienced personnel on the front lines, were unable to respond to this fast and precise threat. The Russian Defense Ministry's propaganda claim that they hit hundreds of targets instantly collapsed with Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov's admission that there was an attack on our critical infrastructure facility and we are experiencing serious power outages. The Russian media's attempt to portray the incident as a transformer failure was debunked within seconds by NASA's firm's satellite system, which detected a massive fire in the area, and by videos taken by civilians. This operation was a massive military symphony, in which more than 230 UAVs served a single purpose, to ensure that a single HIMARS rocket reached its target. And when that rocket hit its target, it destroyed not only a power plant, but also Russia's myth of invincibility. And so Ukraine had put into action a deadly strategy, a logistical strangulation plan, designed to wrap itself around the body of the Russian war machine and slowly suffocate it, leaving it breathless and doomed to collapse under its own weight. The process that began with the main switch being flipped in Belgorod created a cascade effect, rendering the entire network inoperable with the collapse of a single node. This chain reaction, which began immediately after the attack, ruthlessly exposed the regional anatomy of the Russian war machine. The first and most direct impact was felt on the military command and control infrastructure. According to analyses by think tanks such as ISW, the Belgorod Oblast served as a vital rear base for operations in Ukraine.
The power outage instantly plunged the region's ammunition depots, maintenance workshops, electronic listening stations, and most importantly, forward command centers into darkness and silence. Of course, these facilities had generators, but a generator cannot power massive radar antennas or strategic satellite communication terminals. That night, Russian commanders found themselves suddenly transported from the battlefield of the 21st century back to the dark analog world of the 20th century. Encrypted communication lines were severed, situational awareness screens went dark, and the flow of real-time intelligence from the front lines was cut off like a knife. It was like cutting off the oxygen supply to an army's brain. The second wave hit Russia's war industry. Industrial facilities in Belgorod and the surrounding area had rapidly shifted to producing ammunition and military parts for the war effort. The power outage was a crowbar inserted into the gears of this massive production machine. Production lines suddenly halted with an ear-piercing screech. Machines pressing artillery shells stopped. Robotic arms welding tank armor hung suspended in mid-air. With each passing hour, hundreds fewer artillery shells and truckloads of ammunition reached the front lines. But the most devastating ripple effect emerged when it struck the railway network, the steel backbone of the Russian army. Belgorod was one of the most critical junctions of this backbone. The lines passing through here connected resources from Russia's interior to Donbass and Crimea via Rostov in the south. When the power went out, all signaling, switch control, and communication systems managing these lines immediately shut down. Picture this: a 60-car military train loaded with T-90M tanks and BMP-3 armored vehicles is stopped on a track outside Belgorod. The signal lights are dark. The only thing coming from the radio is static. This train, which might have supported an attack, is now nothing more than a rusting pile of metal on the tracks. Fuel tankers, ammunition wagons, trains full of soldiers. All were trapped in the dark labyrinths of Belgorod. Russian logistics had collapsed in an instant. Ukraine had managed to put tens of thousands of tons of steel and thousands of soldiers out of action using just a few hundred kilograms of explosives. This attack also fundamentally shook Russia's established military doctrine. Russian military thinking has always been based on the idea of keeping the war far from its own borders. The Belgorod attack painfully proved that this doctrine is no longer valid in the era of long-range precision weapons in Ukraine's hands. The concept of a front line no longer existed. The effect of this situation on the morale of soldiers at the front was, quite literally, devastating. How long could a soldier's will to fight last when he knew his family was not safe? Ukraine's strategy was to trigger this multi-layered collapse, the domino effect. Strike the thermal power plant to paralyze logistics to weaken the front, but most importantly, bring the war to the Russian people's doorstep to create insecurity and anger on the home front. The Belgorod attack was a terrifying laboratory experiment in which this ruthless equation worked perfectly. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had actually signaled the attack in his statement on September 27th. The Ukrainian leader said, for example, if they threaten power outages in Ukraine's capital, the Kremlin should know that there will be power outages in Russia's capital. And so it happened. What happened in Belgorod is not an isolated incident, but a beginning. This is the first act of a new and ruthless phase of war in which Ukraine will systematically target Russia's critical infrastructure. Every target struck from now on will further erode Russia's capacity to wage war, further fuel discontent on the home front, and push the pressure on the Kremlin to an unbearable point. Russia is now bleeding not only on the battlefield but also at home. Its logistical arteries are being severed, its economic heart is slowing down, and its people's trust in the regime is evaporating. The lights that went out in Belgorod that night were not just a sign of darkness for a city, but also for the future of a regime. This may not be the beginning of the end for Putin, but it is certainly the end of the beginning. There is now no turning back, because the most fundamental force that keeps a nation standing is not its armies, but the faith its people have in it, and the hope they draw from the future. And with the darkness that fell over Belgorod that night, the light of hope in the hearts of millions of Russian citizens has also begun to flicker dangerously. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.